Hello, early European Civ. This is a refresher video about Vikings and monks, kind of things we've covered in class before, but to really draw your attention to, as it'll be very important to you, as well as I'm going to go over things like the topography and archaeology of Iona that you'll find useful, give you some tips as to how to be successful in the game, where you can find more information, etc. So we're going to start off with the Vikings, just as a quick recap. Now, 825 is when our game was set. So remember that Vikings were both raiders and traders, but before they became traders, they were raiders. And we know they were pretty terrifying because of what people wrote at the time. The Vikings were looking for wealth, and therefore they struck at places where there would be wealth for them to steal. So that means monasteries and other settlements. As we know, monks had been busily spreading Christianity to pagan peoples in the early Middle Ages. Many of these monks lived in isolated communities. They were also very highly educated, and because of this, they attracted skilled people and wealth. They were also religious, not warriors, and so this made them really easy targets for Vikings. Vikings were also excellent navigators, and that meant that there wasn't just the sea areas that they targeted, they were able to sail up rivers too and strike inland. What's different about Vikings from other cultures at this time? Well, one difference is arguably their military and sailing technology. An example of their sailing technology actually comes from the dragon boat picture there at the top, and this allowed the boats to be able to sail in very shallow waters and be able to make quick getaways and be highly maneuverable. So what's different about why this all had to happen? Why did this all suddenly kick off with 793 in Lindisfarne? That's our earliest documented Viking raid on a monastery, or even just full stop. Well, historians still argue why all this happened. It does look like Scandinavia, which is the region of Europe where Vikings came from, was undergoing a period of political change with the decline of local chieftains, and instead they were being replaced by much more centralised kings. Plus, the amount of booty that could be gathered from a raid could make an individual or a group thereof very rich indeed. We reckon that you could have got about 30 Vikings on each boat, and a number of boats would have gone together. So that means that in our game, definitely, we don't have all the Vikings represented. Mainly younger men were attracted to this ability to raid, but we do believe that there were some women too. Vikings were comparatively more into, well, gender equality is the wrong term because we definitely can't use our modern terms, but women had more rights in Vikings, in Scandinavian society, I should say, compared to other societies at this time. It's worth remembering too that I'm using the term Viking, and we'll use Viking a lot, but remember, Viking is a job description, not an ethnic group. If we want to talk about an ethnic group, we're better off talking about Scandinavians or Norse. In fact, Norse is a term you'll see quite often. Anybody could be a Viking. Even at the time, Viking translates as pirate. Back in Scandinavian society, though, the way that their society is organised will be of interest to you all. They tended around the time of the raiding period, people to coalesce around different interest groups and their followers. So there would be these chieftains and later kings. Later, in the later period, the chief's followers were called their thingmen. And they would accompany their leader to the thing. The thing was the assembly of followers. Althings or things were general assemblies for all the free landholders, and these are known from multiple areas across Scandinavia. So in our game, we have several people referred to as being thingmen of so-and-so. And although it's a later term, we do know that this structure existed in the time period we're interested in. So that means that our chiefs are, or rather our leaders, because they're not all chiefs, they might want to be though, are followed by their thingmen, and that's how our two Viking factions are arranged to echo this. As I mentioned, the status of women in Scandinavian culture at this time is debated. One source that we've got to know about the status of women are the sagas. Now, these are literary sources and they are later in date, so we're not entirely sure how accurately they reflect the previous centuries. We also, of course, famously get finds of females buried with lots of weapons. And so you see all these things about shield maidens and blah, blah, blah. That's likely really blown out of proportion, but it does tell us that women's legal status in Scandinavian culture was different, as I said, compared to other cultures at the time. It is still, of course, definitely a patriarchal society, but comparatively better for women. So that means that in our game, our women operate more like the woman depicted in the sagas. We've given them a bit more legal independence. So if you've got a female role, you need to keep that in mind. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, our very first Viking raid on a monastery took place in 793 when Viking raiders struck England and raided the monastery of Lindisfarne. We know from the account that was left that the raiders killed the monks and captured all the valuables. And it's this raid that historians use to mark the beginning of a time period that we call the Viking Age of Invasion. Now, it wasn't just raiding, as I said, that the Vikings were up to. They also traded. And as you can see from this map, they could trade really very far away. Silver is key to a Viking. We might think of pirates as being gold, but if you're a Viking, you know, a medieval pirate, it's silver. Silver is what you want. And of course, lots of other things can be traded too. And you're going to need to think about this as you play the game. Slaves, in particular, fetched a very high price in the early Middle Ages, as we see in primary sources like those that you have to read. Other sources suggest that female slaves in particular were worth a lot. In fact, in a lot of these cultures at the time, female slaves were used as monetary values. For example, the vergeld, which you'll remember means blood price in the early Middle Ages, the vergeld of a king in this culture was worth 7 female slaves. So that tells us that female slaves were worth a lot of money. Keep that in mind as we go on through the game. Other good conversion rates to use in this time where nobody's going to whip out their credit card include that a milk cow is roughly equivalent to 1 ounce of silver, which is roughly equivalent to the price of a third of a female slave. Except you're not going to buy a female slave or a third of one, so we're thinking 3 cows for a female slave or 3 ounces of silver. So slaves are very, very valuable. And of course, as I said, our emphasis is going to be on silver. Silver is what you're after if you're a Viking, and anything else that you're going to be able to trade for items that you do want. So by the time we hit the year around 800, there's been lots of raids on the coastlines of the British Isles. And indeed, by the time we hit 865, which is about a generation after our game, the Danes from Denmark land a large army in England, and they actually set out to conquer England. And that's Anglo-Saxon England at that time. They carved out their own territory in the northeast of England that they called the Danelaw. And this is, remember, is only a generation after the time period we're particularly interested in. So the Danelaw is an example of how they gained knowledge from raids and then used it to obtain profitable settlements. It's also worth remembering that Vikings were pagan at the time of our game, but remember, they did convert to Christianity. Normandy and the Normans that we looked at a few weeks ago are probably the best example to study up on that. Now, turning to our monks. Monks were those who started as religious people who rejected society to pursue a spiritual life. And because they rejected society and wanted to be on their own, this reflects the names we give these early monks, a hermit or an anchorite. So this was the ideal way of having a godly life in the early Christian church. But a solitary life did not stay solitary for very long, as many people wanted to experience a spiritual life closer to God. As a result, communities of like-minded individuals formed. All sorts of men wanted to become monks, from the highest status to the very lowliest. the type of monasteries that we looked at in an earlier class that were Irish influenced tended to be in isolated places. And that was to reflect the original ethos of being a monk, that you wanted to be away from worldly temptations. Now, our monks lived in single-sex communities with no contact or very limited contact with the opposite sex. They prayed and they undertook physical labour. Physical labour was mostly connected to farming, and that would help the monastery to be self-sufficient and thus reduce contact with the outside world. Now, they did have tenants to help with this. The tenants, however, were not officially part of the religious order. They were secular tenants, also known as lay tenants. That means they're not part of the church structures. Spiritual growth was also very important to the monks. And so the model for the monastic life, as come up by St. Benedict of Nursia, was the family, with the abbot as the father and all the monks as brothers. So the abbot was the head of the monasteries. Monasteries, you remember, were really important to continuing conversion to Christianity, as these were communities living side by side with lay villages. Travelling outwards from monasteries allowed the monks to convert people to Christianity in a really big area. The variety of different people who became monks meant that poor and rich alike had family and friends who had converted to Christianity and were actively monks. But of course, by the time we're hitting the early 9th century, pretty much only Scandinavia remains to be converted to Christianity. The monks have been that successful. We're going to have to go back earlier in time to see the origins of the monastery of Iona, back to St. Columba, or in Irish, St. Columcille, and that translates to mean church dove. St. Columcille lived in 521 to 597, so we have to go all the way back to the 6th century to get the origin of Iona. St. Columba, he was an Irish abbot, and he was a missionary credited with spreading Christianity into what is today Scotland. He was the one who founded the important abbey on Iona, and Iona soon became a dominant religious and political institution in the region for centuries. Columba is remembered today as a Christian saint. Columba studied under some of Ireland's most prominent church figures, and he founded several monasteries in Ireland as well as in Scotland. It was around the year 563 that he and his 12 companions crossed to Donaverty near Southend in Argyll and Kintyre, and then they settled in Iona, which is an island off the west coast of Scotland, which was then part of the kingdom of Dalriada, and they founded a new abbey here as a base for spreading Christianity amongst the northern pagans. Columba, even though he was mainly based in Scotland, remained active in Irish politics, but he did spend pretty much all the remainder of his life in Scotland. He was a renowned man of letters, he wrote several hymns, and he is credited with having transcribed 300 books. One of the few times that he left Scotland was towards the end of his life, when he returned to Ireland to found the monastery at Durrow. Columba died on Iona, and he was buried on Iona in 597 by his monks in the abbey that he had created. Through the reputation of Columba and its position as a major European centre of learning, Iona became a massive site of pilgrimage. It was also the head of what we call the Columban Federation. That is, a group of monasteries associated with St. Columba that's marked on the map here, and Iona was the leader of these and the most important. Now, Irish monasteries, by which I include Irish-founded monasteries, were very famous in the early medieval world for their learning and their treasures. People could and did move in and out of the monasteries in order to learn. We think that the Book of Kells, one of the most famous illuminated manuscripts, was made around the year 800, possibly entirely at the Scriptoria at Iona, or partially there and then finished the Kells. It's named after Kells, one of the Columban monasteries in Ireland. Now, you remember we looked at the Book of Kells, we looked at those weird-looking animals in one of our quizzes a few weeks ago. You'll also remember that illuminated manuscript means a book that has been handmade with hand-drawn illustrations, and the Scriptoria, singular, Scriptorium, was the writing room that was at monasteries. Because Columba died in Iona in 597, this means that his relics were at Iona. And you will remember some of the relics that were housed in a reliquary from several weeks ago because they were pretty gruesome, and I made you identify some from the Treasures of Heaven website. So remember too, because Iona was associated with Columba, his relics in reliquaries were present at Iona, along with the reliquaries of other important people within the Christian church. So the monastery at Iona was first attacked by Viking raiders in 795, according to the Annals of Innisfallen, with subsequent attacks taking place in 802, 806 and 825. And those annals are in your primary sources, in your information packet. The annals, as you'll see, are kind of like entries of the most important events that took place in a particular year. They were kept by monks in monasteries, and so they're kind of like chronicles with little notes as to what's important to them. As a result, they're a bit biased. And remember, bias is not a negative thing. It just means that people have got a different perspective on things. So it's not the way that it's used willy-nilly in the news today. Instead, the bias that we associate with the annals is that they're written by churchmen. Therefore, they're kind of concerned with being killed and all their treasure stolen. They don't tend to stop a marauding Viking and ask them, hey, what led you into this life? Let me interview you and write it down. So that's what I mean by a bias in the case of the annals. It's written from the church's perspective. It's very hard for us to get at the Viking perspective unless it's a much later source. We know because of these annals that the monks wrote down that in the 806 Viking attack on Iona, 68 monks were killed. And the place where they were killed became known as Martyrs Bay. Now, our game is set during the raid of 825. That means that these earlier raids are still within living memory of some of the game characters. There's been a lot of archaeological research done on Iona, and some of this tells us about the monastic settlements that we're interested in. The picture at the bottom here shows the later Benedictine Abbey. This is a later medieval church, but it seems to have been on the site of earlier medieval church buildings. As you can see, Iona is an island. As you know, it's off the west coast of Scotland. And you can see that it's got lots of rocky outcrops, low hills, with kind of peaty hollows or glens in between. But there are areas of good grazing, and you can see that there are tracts of arable soil. That means they could grow some crops there. The modern village is on the more sheltered eastern part of the island, and we believe that this is where the historic settlement tended to be. At the bottom, you can see that there's some mountains in the background. This is the neighbouring island of Mull. It's much larger, but still, don't think you can go there for help. Around the year 825 that we're interested in, we think that there would have been an enclosure and a small church located to the north of the modern abbey, which, as I said, is later in date. And one of the good terms to know is that the Abbey of Iona was surrounded by a vallum. The vallum is a large circular enclosure, and that's pretty common to find in early monastic sites like Iona. We would have expected to find accommodation for pilgrims who were visiting the shrine of St. Columba, and this was probably also very close to the church. The archaeological findings include hoards of coins, possible early medieval monks' cells, timber buildings, burials, including of women, which indicates that there probably was a female community on Iona as well as a male community. The site was used for a very long time, and it was an active site for pilgrimage over the course of the Middle Ages. We used to think, until very recently, that the raids of the 9th century were so devastating on Iona that all the monks packed up and went to Kells. But actually, this archaeology shows that it was constantly occupied over the course of the Middle Ages. Now, most of the buildings in the time period we're interested in would have been constructed out of timber. But from the 8th century onwards, the most important buildings began to be constructed out of stone. So the church, for example, would have been built out of stone, but domestic and farm buildings all would have been timber. Another primary source in your source book from Adovnan describes in the life of Columba the Magna Domus. That's the communal house of the monks, and it looks like they found the location of where this would have been. It was the largest early medieval building on the island, and it's where all the monks would have lived together and done a lot of their jobs. There are other plans in your sourcebook and other information to help you visualize the community. I'd like to draw your attention to an article published just last year that if you're interested in the archaeology, and even if you're not that interested in the archaeology, it's going to be a good read. And it's open source as well. So you'll need to follow the links embedded here, or Google it even. If you Google it, the title here, you should be able to find a free copy of it online. And this writes up the archaeological investigations, and there's some really useful findings for our game. I actually pulled out this image from a talk I went to recently by Ewan Campbell, one of the chief authors of this of this article. And this picture here is kind of a very rough estimation of what the medieval settlement, the early medieval settlement would have looked like. So what you're seeing down towards the bottom, you see a cemetery is marked, and then we've got a walkway or a pathway leading past lots of chapels and crosses and other cemeteries into the heart of the monastery itself. Has more crosses and buildings, and you can see the vallum, the brown circular parts on this map as well. So basically what this means is down at the very bottom where our first cemetery is marked, that is the main landing point for the abbey. So our Vikings and anybody else would have landed here and then run or walked, if you're not in a rush like a Viking, the walkway lined by crosses and entered the monastery proper. So I want you to imagine that. We're going to use Google Street View as well to help us imagine that even if we're at home, we're in Iona in mind, if not in body. So I recommend this article. It's also on the reading list that's in your source book. Top tip, read that one, but also use the reading list that I provided for you. I'd encourage you to use the Kent Library resources. In particular, JSTOR, which we have available for free to us as long as we go via the library website, is really, really useful. In part because JSTOR, we've got the Ireland collection of journals on JSTOR. So that means that there's lots that you'll be able to access from home, any time of the day or night, for free via the library in JSTOR. And you know it's going to be scholarly because, remember, scholarly sources only, people. Only scholarly sources. So use the library resources if in doubt. Do not Google any of this. Oh my God, this is a topic that the weirdos just love to jump on, and I do not want to see anybody repeating anything really highly skeptical or dubious or just outright weird. So go via the library and save us all heartache. Here's some. I've played this game with students in numerous classes before, but this is the first semester that we'll be playing online. But at least, you know, we've played it lots of times before and students really enjoy it. So I do a survey at the end. I'll have you do that survey as well. And here are some top tips from former students. Mainly, the most commonly given advice that I see every semester is do your research. Don't forget to, you know, read up, because that gives you the edge over the other students and makes you more likely to accomplish your goals. And stop being embarrassed. Just get into character and let loose. They regretted most of all hanging back the first week and instead wish they'd just thrown themselves in, and instead they really got into it when it was kind of too late. Another kind of words assigned the same false friend situation is the hoard and the hoard. I put this down here, the bullet point in the bottom right. Hoard, H-O-A-R-D, is what the Vikings believe the monks and the tenants have hidden on Iona. The hoard, H-O-R-D-E, is a group of people. So the hoard, H-O-R-D-E, of Vikings are looking for the hoard, H-O-A-R-D. So they sound the same, but they're spelled differently. So make sure you get them the right way round. I want to also remind you that you should communicate with each other. Be careful what you share with your other players, though. Discord is what we will be using. So you can log into Discord and send each other messages at any time you feel like. We'll also be using Discord for speeches. So make sure you familiarize yourself with how things work over there. Please do talk to me Dr. McAllister or to my teaching assistant, Ms. Fano. We are both the Game Master, so if you see anything referred to as the Game Master, it's either going to be me or Ms. Fano. Talk to us, email us, ask us for our help. So we'll help you come up with solutions. We'll help you with advice, with strategizing, without giving you away anybody's secrets. Likewise, things like ghost students. Let us know if somebody is not pulling their weight and you don't know what to do. We're here to help you. So do reach out to us, and you can email us or you can use Discord as well. So go rearrange your information booklets and the primary sources. Good idea to print it off and make your own notes. You've got a quiz due. We've got to familiarise yourself with Discord. Lots to do this week to make sure you're ready to hit the ground running next week.